Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
This particular podcast has what I call a digest, a short summary of my thoughts and the highlights and the things I most enjoyed about it. You can find that at the end of this podcast. So you can either listen to the whole podcast and the digest at the end, or just the digest at the end.
Hi, this is Richard Jacobs with Future Tech Podcast. Today my guest is Chris Berka, the CEO of Advanced Brain Monitoring. Chris, how you doing?
I'm great. It's nice to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. So, can you tell folks, what do you guys do at Advanced Brain Monitoring?
Sure. Advanced Brain Monitoring is a medical device manufacturer. We've actually been in business for 17 years now, and we have created a whole series of, we actually have 7 products, and they're all designed to be very mobile, scalable, easy to apply, comfortable for patients, and these devices all quantify physiological signals. We focus, as our name suggests, quite a bit on the brain and the brain's electrical activity, the EEG, but we also measure many cardiac and pulmonary, so respiration measures. We have measured things like galvanic skin response, which is essentially changes as a function of anxiety or arousal. And we do a lot of work with accelerometers and actigraphs, similar to the types of things that are in your phones, and then also look at muscle activity. So what I like to say is if there's anything that you can measure non-invasively from the human body or brain, we've probably tackled that at some point in time. Go ahead.
Have you had a chance to debunk ESP or telekinesis because you measure the body?
We've done a lot of work with looking at groups of people together, or specifically at dyads. So looking simultaneously at 2 people's brains and hearts, and you do see things that we call neural synchronies or physiological synchronies when people are getting along or having a conversation that is very productive. You'll see certain signals in the brain and the heart that will tend to synchronize across those 2 people. So I think that's as close as we get to, communication, changing communication or understanding communication between people. Does that make sense?
What kind of synchronies have you seen?
Well, so there's a long literature and history actually on cardiac synchrony, in that people who are either a couple or in a group together or in a therapy session will tend to show cardiac synchrony, meaning their hearts beat not necessarily at exactly the same rate, but in harmonic frequencies of each other. So there's what we call coherence across people. And about 5 years ago, we started looking at the brains of people during team interactions, and found that we could identify certain team brain states that were indicative of whether the team would solve a particular problem or achieve a goal. And a lot of that had to do with whether their brains were synchronized, the brain activity was synchronized or desynchronized at various points. And you could identify members of a team who may not be in sync with the rest of the team because their brain activity reflected that. So I think that's a really interesting area. It's an area that we've kind of pioneered. We're just starting to unravel what we might be able to do with that information.
Yeah, what's your guess on what you'd be able to do with it?
Well, I mean, we've already shown that we can track when teams come together for the first time and they do training exercises over a 6 or a 12-week period. We can track the teams as they move from novice to expert. And we've also shown that we can identify, we did a very large study with the Asadi Business School in Barcelona, where we had 35 teams of 4 or 5 business school students solving an ethical decision problem. And in that, we were able to identify both who would emerge from the team as a leader. And what we saw there was that every time the emergent leader spoke, the team engagement levels would go up as measured by our EEG metric. So the leaders were more engaging than the non-leaders. And we showed that that was not related to how often people spoke. So sometimes people would speak frequently and the team engagement levels would go down. So we think that, that's a really interesting finding. It's been reported at the American Academy of Management, and we have a manuscript in preparation on that. What we also found in that particular exercise was that we have an EEG-based measure of empathy, and we found that teams that had one or more members exhibiting this biomarker of empathy ended up coming up with more creative and more ethical solutions to the problem. So, two important brain biomarkers for team performance and team success.
How much of an improvement in results or cohesiveness of a team or other metrics have you seen once a team, coheres or their brainwaves align?
Yeah, so the very first study we did was with high school students teams solving math and science problems. And in that experiment, which was fairly straightforward in that they had a kind of a direct path, each one of the team members had to contribute to the solution. And that was the first time that we were able to map about halfway through the problem solving. We could identify from the team brain states whether they were going to correctly solve the problem or not. So that was a relatively simple experimental environment. With the Asadi study, it was much more free form in that the teams just came together and discussed this ethical case, which is a standard case study they do in business school. And there, as I said, we were able to identify the leaders and predict or come up with some assessments as to which teams would perform optimally on the test.
What correlates with better performance? What do you see, literally?
So that was a combination of the empathy metric, which was directly correlated with the creativity of the problem solutions, and got the highest ratings on the ethical decision. But we also saw that those teams with the highest engagement levels during the exercise came up with higher scores on the problem solving.
So it sounds like teams that had a good leader that was able to get people to engage more were able to solve the problems in a more creative way. Yeah,
absolutely. And what we did with that data is we created little videos where we had the team exercises videotaped, and then we had little quantifications of who spoke and when and how much they spoke, and then we would play back for the teams so they could see when they were speaking or other team members were speaking, how the team engagement levels changed and how that reflected over time. So you can only imagine if you're on a team and you're speaking frequently and you see that your team's engagement levels are going down, that you might change. I mean, the idea is eventually to give people feedback based on these metrics so that they can change their behavior appropriately.
Have you figured out any ways to get a team to cohere faster?
That's a really interesting question. So we have tried a couple different approaches. One, if you have the option of swapping out team members, so because we can, in the first 10 minutes of an exercise, we can see how coherent the team is. If there's one person that's completely out of sync with the rest of the team and you have the option of swapping a team member, that's one intervention. But another intervention is if you're forced, in many cases, whether in Some of this work was done for the military and some was done in the private sector. But you may not have that option. You may be forced to bring a particular team together. And what we've tried there is actually giving the team members training to make their heart rates coherent. So by giving them essentially biofeedback, whether it's through visual displays or auditory or even haptic or tactile feedback, to try to get them to bring their heart rates into coherence with the team. And that actually drives their brains into synchrony as well, if they can, achieve that. So that's just one exercise that we've tried, but it's something that we're investigating, what kinds of feedback can we give the teams in a live environment to help them become more coherent and cooperative.
Because it makes me wonder, if you have a team, one real simple way to make them more effective may be to have everyone start out with a breathing exercise.
Right, absolutely.
To get everyone's heart in coherence and then work on a problem. That might work
exactly
faster.
What we did, yeah, because as you probably are aware, breathing drives your heart rate, slow, deep breaths. And if you do that together with your team members, it's much easier to achieve some heart rate coherence. And then that leads to brain coherence. So there it is a step-by-step process that can start with the breathing, which is the most under your conscious control. Although we found most people can learn to control their heart and their brain with maybe a half hour or an hour feedback training session.
Well, let's talk about that. So, what have you done in that area? What do people want to lower their heart rate or control the variability, or what do they want to do with their brain? What do they want to learn to do with the feedback?
Yeah, so I mean, the simplest approach or exercises in so many of our studies, whether we're studying learning or cognitive decision making or cognitive decline, one of the biggest deterrents to learning is sort of that anxiety response where you have, your heart is racing and you're afraid of the consequences, so it's all negative emotional states. And so in most cases there, we're just teaching people to slow down their heart rate, and we do that, through a combination of breathing exercises and feedback on heart rate. And then do that first in a quiet room and then re-expose them to whatever the stress was. So, if it's public speaking or the fear of failure in a chemistry experiment, to then teach them to try to maintain that control of their heart rate while they're in their stressor environment. And that's always the next level of challenge. So we've worked with patients with PTSD, a number of military populations. We've done some marksmanship training, and always, first training people to control their heart rate and their anxiety levels, and getting control over that whole cardiovascular respiratory function. It is a great asset when you're going into any new training experience.
Very interesting. What about control of your brainwaves? Is there anything there that's useful?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we've done a variety of things. One project that we worked on that DARPA funded was to accelerate marksmanship skill training, and there we identified a particular brain state that was associated with taking a perfect shot. We're right by Camp Pendleton here, so we had access to a group of Marine marksmanship coaches who were willing to come in and have their brains monitored, and we identified a particular, what we called the pre-shot peak performance state. And
oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, and it was very consistent in the experts, where just before taking a perfect shot, they would have a heart rate deceleration and then an increase in the alpha brain activity over the left temporal parietal region and an increase in the theta EEG activity over the midline. And so after we identified that, characterized it, we had a group of 300 subjects, that half civilian and half Marines. The Marines all had some level of marksmanship training. Some of the civilians did. Some of them, the Marines actually helped us develop a whole marksmanship training program. And then we took half of that group and we trained them using feedback to move their heart and brain into that expert state. So they had a couple hours of training, and then they picked up the rifles and went on, to do the marksmanship drills. And what we found is, and half of the subjects, the control subjects, only had access. They could keep practicing. They could watch some of the videos that the Marines had, but they didn't have any physiological feedback training. And what we found is that those who had the training, it increased their marksmanship skill acquisition by a factor of 2.3. So it really made a huge difference in the ability to shoot accurately. So it's kind of, after you learn how to use a rifle, it's that last step of, really kind of screening out the environmental noise and focusing in on the target. And then we went over to the archery center, and we found that we have a lot of Olympic archers who practice here in San Diego, and they have pretty much exactly the same state as the expert marksman just before they pull the bow. And we also did a little bit of work with golf as well. So any activity where you have to kind of screen out irrelevant distraction and focus in on a target, this particular brain state training works really well for.
What is the training like? When you train someone to influence their brainwaves and influence their heart, literally, what are you doing? Like, do you train them to breathe in a certain way and everything comes from there, or to think about something?
We have a really simple headband device that has 4 brain sensors and a heart sensor all in the headband. And then we have a variety of ways we can give feedback. So the feedback can be visual, it can be auditory, or it can be tactile. So particularly for the marksmanship and archery, because they might want to practice out on the field where you can't give them visual feedback, and for marksmen you can't give them auditory because they have earplugs in. So we built this little buzzer that is just like what's in your cell phone, a little vibratory buzzer, and you clip it onto your shirt collar, and it starts the feedback by buzzing you in concert with your heart. So that's your first cue. It's like, if my heart is racing, then I know I need to take some deep breaths. And we came up with about 8 or 9 different strategies that people use to control their hearts. Breathing is just one. Some people, visualize a particular color that they find really pleasing, or they visualize, that they're on a beach, or so. I mean, there's a number of different ways of achieving that control over your heart rate, but that you have to get that heart rate under control first. And then the way we designed it, that feedback, is when you achieve the EEG or the brain state, it stops buzzing. So that's your cue to shoot. And again, people did various, exercises to be able to move their brain state towards that of an expert. We found about 85% of people that we brought in for a day of training could achieve some control over their heart and brain in one day.
That's great. Can you talk about any of the other methods? You said imagine a color that you like, imagine yourself in a scene like at a beach, deep breathing, any other mechanisms that work really well?
So, I mean, we had some people just counting backwards, or something very rhythmic like that was effective.
Okay.
Trying to remember some of the other things. Those are all I can remember off the top of my head. Deep breathing works best for most people, but sometimes that only works to control your heart rate, and then getting control over the brain sometimes requires focusing on something intensely. So the goal is you want to shut down all the distracting thoughts, and that's not always really easy to achieve. But the important thing is that you learn to do it well enough that you can do that in any environment. So with the Marines, for example, the experts told us that they literally had a switch in their head that they were completely aware of, and that they could turn on even in a combat scenario that would just allow them to go into that state, sufficient to take the shot and then move on. So you can imagine, that's got to be the most distracting environment from a survival standpoint, but you can achieve this control even under stressful situations.
Huh, it's amazing. So tell me more about the products you have. You said you have a headband. Tell me a little bit about that.
So we have,
what other products you have?
So we have a number of FDA-cleared medical diagnostic products. Sleep is one of our specialties. So we have several in-home sleep monitoring systems that you can use to diagnose sleep apnea. You can use to assess different types of insomnia, or to evaluate the sleep architecture. So how long does it take to get to sleep, and then how much time do you spend in the different stages? So deep sleep is really important, we know, for healing and memory consolidation. And then REM sleep is very important for creativity and also for linking your new memories to your old memories. So you need, good proportions of all of those sleep stages. And so what happens is the patient, we can either drop ship the devices to the patient's home, they can put them on themselves, and then they either send it back or they upload the data to our cloud portal, and then we can give a report to the sleep physician or the treating physician. And then we have a number of different daytime assessments. We've been focusing quite a bit on neurodegenerative disease, so Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, frontotemporal dementia. And there we do a combination of a resting state, EEG, so we can look at, what happens when the patient has their eyes closed and are resting. And then we have a series of attention, memory, and learning tasks to stimulate those circuits in the brain, and then we examine the EEG while they're doing an attention task or a memory task or learning task. And that's being used by a number of pharmaceutical companies in evaluating new treatments for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and frontotemporal dementia. And that works somewhat similar in that we can ship those systems anywhere in the world. We have technicians at the clinical sites that can be trained really quickly. They acquire the data and they send it through our cloud portal, and then we send out a report on the result.
So for consumers, what have you seen are their biggest wants in learning how to work with their heart and their brain? What do they want to do? What kind of goals do they have?
I think anxiety is a huge issue. So, and there are some other, consumer-oriented devices. Our devices are, for the most part, they require a prescription. The training device that we built for marksmanship is probably our first step into something more that's non-medical, that doesn't require a prescription. But it's still going to be a fairly expensive device compared to some of the consumer systems. But I think anxiety, we have been talking a lot to the business community about the team neurodynamics and how that platform might be useful for improving team performance, and that is a very large need across a variety of sectors. But we don't sell anything right now directly to the consumer.
What do you envision creating and selling either for this year or the next few years? What are some goals you have? What do you want to create?
Well, I think one really important goal with the Alzheimer's and Parkinson's is that we're in working with companies like Biogen and Ionis and J&J, we hope to be able to have really good EEG-based diagnostics that follow the drugs into the clinic. So you need a combination of, you can have a great diagnostic, but we also need better treatments for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And then we would pair our diagnostic with a particular treatment. So identify the right patient for that treatment and then evaluate the effectiveness of that treatment. And then the teaming, like I said, we've been talking quite a bit now to a number of industry partners about how we might be able to use this teaming platform to both improve the team members and the team constituents, but also improve the team performance. So I think that's something that we're really looking over the next couple of years to have a product, at least a product platform for. And then the other thing, we're doing a lot of work in the sleep area to help people understand the importance of sleep for brain health. I think we're starting to get a glimmer of that. Ariana Huffington has been a great communicator in terms of understanding, how important sleep is and how little we value it. So, a lot of our work in the sleep area is to try to educate both the public and the professional community on the importance of sleep.
Yeah, I read her book on sleep. It was really good.
Yeah, it's very important, and we're learning now that there's all these links between sleep and neurodegenerative disease. We already knew there were links between sleep and cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity. And it's something that society doesn't necessarily put a high premium on, but I think that we just need to keep informing the public about how important sleep is.
All right, so how can people find out more about your products and start to engage with your company? What's the best way?
Sure. So our website is advancedbrainmonitoring.com, and there's quite a bit of information on there, all about our devices, lots of academic publications, and just general information.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And,
sure, thank you.
There's a lot for people to check into.
Okay, good. It's a pleasure.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. I've decided to start including a digest of the interviews I do, clustered all at the same time. The digest will just give a few points from each interview that I found particularly interesting or useful. And it's for people that may not want to listen to the entire podcast, may not have time, or just want to hear what I took away from it. Why would you want to hear what I think? Who cares about that? Well, I've done well over 160 interviews in the past 5 months, so I've gotten quite a bit of insight. In some industries, I've done 50 or 60 interviews, like Bitcoin, blockchain. So I have a good overview of the landscape now in several industries, and the ins and outs, the ups and downs, and what all the players are doing. And therefore, I think my insight may be very much of use to you. So my executive summary, Chris Berka, CEO of Advanced Brain Monitoring. We talked about their devices and how they can collect information on your brain waves, your heart rate, other biological factors, and help provide you feedback that you can take action on. And what I thought was fascinating about this interview is Chris had groups of people in a study. I forget the name, but they tried to work on a problem, either a creative problem or a technical problem. And they noticed that the first thing that happened is that the people's heart rates would come in sync. They may not beat at the exact same rate, but they would actually beat at harmonic frequencies of the rate, which I guess is, one heart may beat twice as much as the other, or 3/5 or 4/5. Maybe very close together, but at certain specific intervals. And then once that happened, their brain waves would kind of sync up in a way. And it gets more technical in the interview, but what happened is that they could tell, they said, when groups of people, they could tell who is the leader in the group, first of all, because they saw that when the leader spoke, other people in the group responded a lot more their brains actually responded a lot more when that person spoke, showing that that person really truly was a leader that was being listened to. And they also saw people in the group that weren't being listened to, that weren't moving the crowd or, literally winning hearts and minds, literally, which is kind of funny. But that was amazing. They could tell when groups were going to solve a problem and when groups would not solve a problem based on the synchrony of their brainwave patterns and their heart rate patterns, which I think is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure this leads to all kinds of benefits down the road where they can help groups, again, come to consensus in meetings or brainstorm or work together and point out the people in the group that aren't working together with the rest of the group or who aren't effective. Or if you want to give a speech, let's say you get a focus group. Now you could probably look at the brain waves and the heart rates of the focus group and see if what you're saying is resonating with them. Give you an example of your product or service and tell you if it's going to sell better or not. So I just thought that was really, really interesting. Then we talked about skill acquisition. She talked about Marine snipers and how they were able to block out noise and other distractions when they were about to take a shot, to take what she termed the perfect shot. And I would guess if you use this feedback system, if you want to be a sniper or if you want to do any other task, dancing, playing violin, whatever it may be, selling, and you're able to block out distraction and train your mind and your brain to focus in when you need it to and train your heart to be under control so that you can control your anxiety, you could be far more effective at what you do, whatever that may be. So that was really interesting too. So I can see there's a lot of uses for these feedback mechanisms. So that's the digest for today's interview. Hope you found it helpful. And again, I encourage you to listen to the entire podcast, but if you don't have time and you just want the quick lowdown, you can listen to this digest. Thank you.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.